Okay, this is the final little PowerPoint video just to finish off with. So you will have hopefully read through the notes on this third shift that I've suggested takes place in our praying. And this one is from prayer as a way of being in control of life to prayer as our surrender to the purposes and the will of God for our lives. And in terms of the painting, I guess what I'm looking at there is at the back of the boat, we see, well, there's a figure closest to us who could conceivably look a little bit like Jesus. And he's the one who has his hand on the tiller, controlling the rudder and controlling the journey. The other companion in the boat does seem to be holding the rope that controls something of the sail, but really a lot of the journey is not in the control of that person. And so I think as we go through life, we realize it's not about us being at the center of everything and trying to control things. And sometimes our prayer verges on a way of getting what it is that we want in our lives. But this picture for me says something about surrendering and trusting God, trusting Jesus to lead us in this journey, and surrendering ourselves to him in our prayer. And from that point of view, one thing I notice about some of the great prayers and writers about prayer down through the centuries, one of the things they say is it's not unusual for our prayer to become less and less wordy as we go further on the journey. We start off with a lot of words and a lot of good ideas that we want to tell God about how he might run the universe, and more we let that go, and more we might just really sit in silence in the presence of God and be conscious that he is God and we are not, and we are there to love him, to pay attention to him, and to surrender to him. I mentioned, or I reminded you of the quote about spiritual disciplines that we had a couple of weeks ago from Richard Foster. The purpose of those disciplines is for us to put ourselves before God so that he can transform us. Prayer is not about us coming to God to transform his actions in the world, but rather trusting that as we place our lives in his hands, as we take up Mary's prayer, let it be done to me according to your word, then he will work his purposes out through us, and he will use our prayer as part of that. And the quote from David Benner in the reading that you had for this lesson: the core of the misunderstanding lies in thinking that prayer is something that we do. Understood more correctly, prayer is what God does in us. I've been kind of hammering that a bit in this lesson, just because I think it's something we don't always take on board. Our part has more to do with consent than initiative. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let it be with me according to your word. Those beautiful words of Mary as the angel gave her a glimpse of what God's purposes for her and for her son might be. And the person who put me onto the picture of the boat as a way of thinking about prayer was actually in a book by this Catholic nun called Sister Wendy Beckett. She died recently, but she was a very interesting and quirky person. She was brilliant. She went to the same university college as Tolkien and performed as brilliantly as he did in terms of academic success. And for a number of years, this was going back to the 1970s and 80s, she was a presenter on BBC talking about art, and she would talk very knowledgeably about the history of art, and very interesting. But she's also produced a couple of little books on pieces of art and her reflections about how they speak to us of spirituality and God and prayer. And really, she hated being in the limelight on TV on BBC. It was not her at all. And And so later in life she said, really all I want to do is to be in my little caravan where I live, and to pray. And what she meant by praying is spelled out in this quote: prayer is God's taking possession of us. Wow, think about that line. Prayer is God's taking possession of us. We expose to him what we are. He gazes on us with the creative eye of holy love. And then in between the two bits that are here, she says, you know, what is the point of pretending? Don't put on your best airs and graces in prayer. Be honest, be yourself. He cannot transform us if we insist on only offering to him our goodness, our successes, our strengths. Controlled prayer is only partial prayer. It is the giving up the control to God that makes prayer true. So that is a very deep thought, and in some ways, probably for us and our egos, a rather troubling thought, isn't it? Prayer is God's taking possession of us. It's giving up control to God. No wonder we perhaps tend to sometimes avoid prayer or keep it a bit superficial, because, man, if we surrender our lives to God at that level, if we surrender through prayer, if we give up the controls, what might God do? We don't know. That's a little bit scary. But remember, he gazes on us with the creative eye of holy love. His purposes are only good. So you might like to reflect on your own familiar ways of being with God, whether it's in times of prayer or meditation or worship or whatever, and just ask yourself this question about those ways of being with God. Do they help take you to a place of deeper surrender to God, or do they in some ways protect you from that surrender? Do they enable you to have your hands firmly on the rudder steering the boat? Some of our ways of being with God, and they're good things, you know, they're not bad things, but just have a little thought about how much it's about letting go and letting God, and how much it's about seeking something from God that you want, your agenda rather than God's. Challenging question. And it's very important as we think about that, as we finish this off, remember we are surrendering under that gaze of love, not under the glare of God's judgment. We started the course with the prodigal son story early on, thinking about grace, and that picture of the prodigal being embraced by the father on his return. He had nothing to offer. He had no goodness, no record of faithful service. He had nothing. He had squandered his father's inheritance. He had nothing to bring except himself, just as he is. Notice the bare feet and the ragged clothes, and the father embraces him. So we are surrendering in our prayer to the hospitality of grace, and in our prayer and in our surrender we will find our true home in the Father's love. Amen.